In past lectures, I covered how to create a script from a recording, but these days web APIs are very popular, and you can test those URLs even if they're not embedded within HTML. Typically, if you have a web API for providing a service, there's a published API and the parameters are published, and what you can expect the service to do is documented. So you do have to know the URL and the request characteristics, whether it's a post or a GET. So in this lecture, what I'm going to do is I'm going to cover how to create a script without doing a recording. I'm going to show adding verification points to that script and adding another URL to the script if you find that you need to add additional URLs after you initially created the test. I'll show how to check the content and how to extract references. All right, let me show you how to create a script without recording it, creating a script from scratch. So I have a workspace here that I created brand new, and I'm going to create a new test. Now typically we do new test from recording, but this is just new test. That's the difference. And I'll create the test and give it a name. I happen to be testing a Node.js application that I've written, simple application. Ask you to give it a description. And this Node.js service provides a web API. And I'm going to use HTTP protocol. This is a bit of a wizard here. It helps you get things set up. So it asks how many pages to generate, what's the name of the host, what port, and for sake of showing this, I'll create three pages with one HTTP request per page. It's going to give you a bit of a template to work with. And that's the name of my server, and it's running on port 3000. And then it gives you a summary that, I believe the summary stays with the test. And then you click finish, it generates the test. And it created 3 HTTP requests, labeled 1, 2, 3. And they're going to my server at that port. That's a good starting point. It generated test variables and server access configurations, so you can change the name of the server if you need to. It generated response code of 200. Assume that you got a 200 response. And you can see there that the URL is just / and that's not the URL that I want to go to. I have a set of URLs that are the API for this service, and I happen to be testing it with curl, which is a Unix tool for fetching a URL. You just give it a URL and it fetches it. And so for this one, the URL is actually cat items. So I'm going from the URL tester tool, and I'm just creating this test based on that. I will add a response code error check. I'll say an exact check, so I want exactly 200, and anything else I'll treat as an error. And that request fetches all items. This one fetches one particular item. So for my second request, I'm going to give it that URL. And once again, you can substitute. That's fetching item 4321, but you can treat that as a variable in RPT script and substitute as you execute. I'm going to add the exact error check. 200 response code is what I want. And the final URL I'm going to test right now is a more complicated one. It's a post item that has a request body, and it has a request header of content type of application JSON. So I'll be able to create a little bit more complicated test. The URL is cat items. So let me make that the URL for this test. And it has a request body, which is this. Once again, I can substitute for this at runtime if I want to, but right now it's hard-coded. And to add data to the request, you click on the Add button, and then you can modify it. And then I'll just paste that right here. So that's the body data. So I've got the request and the body data. Let me add a response code verification point while I'm looking at that. And I still haven't sent request headers. There is a request header. It's a content type request header for application JSON. So what I'll do there is I'll copy this content type, and then I'll add the header by saying add request header, and it gives me a choice. So I pick it out of the list here. You could manually type in any header you want to. They give you the choice of the standard ones. And so there I made the content type of the request application JSON. So now it almost matches that CURL, the curl request, but that was a post request. So let me change this from get to post. There. And so now we'll post the request with that request body and request header of content type application JSON describing that request data. Save this. By default, it calls the page titles 1, 2, 3 with that wizard, but I will give it a more meaningful name so that in my reports it shows up as a meaningful name. Let's see, the first one was get all items. And let me throw in think time here. Not too long because I want to demo this. Running. The second one was fetch a particular item. And let me give it a think time. And the third one was add a new item to the database. And the data was in that JSON request. And let's give it a think time, 12 seconds, 12 milliseconds if I'm not careful. And that's the product ID that will be added to the database with this request. Let me save that. And let me just mention that my test server code is not all implemented yet, so that request to run this will actually fail on that third step because it won't get a 200 return code. So now the test is running. And you'll see the data as it runs. You'll see the requests as they come. And there was the get all items, and it's green, and the get one item is green. And the add new item to the database failed. That's why that's red. And it really did fail because of the code on my test server is not all working yet. So there you go. I implemented a test based on the CURL test that I already had and ran it. Right, you may have noticed that I had 3 steps in that test, but my curl test had 4 steps. So now I'll show you how to manually add another request. Click on the top of the test, say add HTTP page. And you have to pick which connection you want to use, and I want to connect to my Node.js test server, so I have to select it. Say OK. I'll be going to that server, and it generates a page with no title. So I'll give it a title. Call it manually added delete. And I'll give it a think time. I'll make it a delete type of request instead of a get. And this is what the URL looks like when executed with curl. So it's just cat items and the item number, and it's a delete request. So let's put that as the URL. And let's add a verification to the response code. And that'll do it. So now I have a 4-step test. And I can do that as many times as I need to, whenever I need to. To make this test more robust and more like a real test, let me add some content checks. Now, when RPT generated these requests for me, of course it doesn't know what content to expect or what to put in there. And there's any number of ways you can get that content, but since I already executed the test, RPT will actually tell me what the content looks like in the protocol data viewer, the response content field. So if we get all items, that is what the response looks like, the response content. So I will copy it and go back to the test. And in the content pane for that request, I will simply paste what came in when I actually played it back. And now RPT has some idea of what the data is, and I can add content checks based on this response data. So let me add a content verification point. And I'm going to add that string that I copied, all items, and I'm going to change it to pass if all strings are found, which should be the default, but it's not. And I change it from case sensitive, because why not? So this creates a string, then I have to select it, and then I enable it. And now that request will check the content that's returned, and it will look for all items. Now, one of the things that we might want to do with the response data is extract something out of it. And before, when I added the content verification check, I copied all the data. That was the actual response. And I don't think, to do the content check, I don't think I really needed to copy the data here. But to do a reference extraction, you do need the data here. So I'm going to create a reference. I'm going to try to pull out the ID that's associated with Barnes. So I'm going to create a reference extraction. I'm going to call it Barnes ID. It's just the person's name. And check to make sure the name's unique. And let me edit the reference properties. And RPT generated a regular expression that looks like that. That's not very generic. I think I'll try to make it a little bit less dependent on that long number, which presumably I won't know in advance. So let me change the regular expression. Get rid of the number. Make the stuff that's in front of it match what's in the page. And verify that it still pulls out that number. Verify that works. So now there's a reference. RPT here is asking, do you want to try to do any substitutions? I really don't have anything to substitute right now. And so there it is. I created a reference out of a page that I populated by hand. So there you have it. I created a test based on a published API, and I did that from scratch without recording it. And I added verification points. I added another URL to the script after the initial test creation. I added content checks, and I added a reference extraction. So fairly easy to create a test based on a published web API.